Sometimes it is the nastiest little critters among us that have a whole lot of power. We're talking about the realm of reputation because no one who is worried about your reputation, no one who is worried about what other people think about you is doing anything with their own life. That is a maxim by which you can live. Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where literature lives. We are here for another short story discussion, which will appear, of course, in the short story discussion playlist, a playlist now approaching 150 videos strong. The short story in question today is known as A Piece of String by Guy de Maupassant, or Guy de Maupassant if you happen to speak Swahili. We are here for a video that will have three different sections. Number one, a So What Happened recap of the short story. Number two, a literary criticism portion where we talk about all of the literary goings-on in this short story. And number three, of course, a writer's corner portion where we talk about any of the little things that we can take away from this short story to make ourselves better writers. So, what happened? We're in Girderville, and it is a farming town, but it is market day in the fall, and everyone is on their way into town. Among them is Master Aushicum, who notices a piece of string on the ground, so he bends and picks it up. This is, after all, a farming town where everything matters, right? So maybe this is not the most prolific find of all time, but who knows? You might have to keep a stack of sticks together. You might have to bundle up some logs, something, and there's a piece of string now for it. But bending over and picking up that string is difficult because he is weathered by living a life full of labor. A lot of creaks and noises as he bends and picks this thing up. Master Malandain saw him do it, which is awkward because they hate each other because of a bad business deal, because maybe Malandain's kind of a jerk. Maybe Aushicum is kind of a jerk. We never really get enough to tell. Somebody there is probably a prick. So Aushicum puts the string in his vest and then finds it awkward there, so he moves it to his pocket. So he's just kind of fidgeting with that string as he conceals it. So he goes to town. He's in town. He's at the market. And the town crier comes about. The town crier announces that a pocketbook was lost and that the finder should turn it into the mayor for a 20-franc reward. Soon, an officer comes to summon Aushicum to the mayor's office himself. Once there, the mayor tells him he's accused of picking up the pocketbook and concealing it. Aushicum denies it, but no one believes him, and even says, "Hey, search me. I didn't know I was coming here to be harangued about some pocketbook. Search me," and he doesn't have it. Doesn't matter. No one believes him. The next day, someone does return the wallet, said that he did not speak the language, so he had no idea what was going on when the crier was coming about. Still, no one believes Aushicum. They say that what he's done here is he has given the pocketbook to his friend to turn in the next day so that he does look innocent. This absolutely destroys Aushicum, who wastes away, and in fact, so this is in the fall, he's dead by the first week of January. It ruined him that much. So what are the literary goings-on here that we can talk about from this short story? Well, this is an interesting one because it jumps into something that is, I think, tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think it's kind of new age. When I was growing up, so many years ago, and we were told about the types of conflict, we were told there was man versus nature, and man versus self. Now they have more designations. It's a little bit strange though, because I think that it is kind of so when you were a kid and you were learning about the types of conflict and they said man versus man, the first thing that you thought was, well, what if it's a woman? The second thing you thought was, well, what if it's two other mans? And I think that man versus man and so I think that they have gone too far with this because the major types of conflict really are that simple, even if there are a couple different ones worth talking about. So this is from Wikipedia. The major types of conflict. The basic types of conflict in fiction have been commonly codified as man versus nature, and man versus self. Although frequently cited, these three types of conflict are not universally accepted. Sometimes a fourth basic conflict is described as man versus society, which is what we have here. Some of the other types of conflict referenced include man versus machine, The Terminator, Brave New World, man versus fate, Oedipus Rex, man versus the supernatural, The Shining, and man versus God, A Canticle for Leibowitz. I would argue that man versus, so another one that's often thrown in here is man versus technology. It's not in this example that we get from Wikipedia, but it is a common one. Man versus technology. I would argue man versus society is man versus man, because it is someone else doing the stuffs, right? It is not arguing with yourself, as in man versus self. It is not arguing with the immovable but constantly evolving force, which is nature. It is basically man versus man. After all, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and the group of men will act in the same way as an individual. So, I think that man versus society is kind of a meaningless designation. I think that man versus technology is kind of interesting because I don't think it's necessary. And I think if we're going to put it into one of these other categories, it's closest akin actually to man versus nature. How can that be? The only thing that makes man versus technology interesting is if the technology itself has its own will, right? So you're not, if you have man versus technology, it's not man versus a red wheelbarrow. It's man versus artificial intelligence. It's man versus an android. It's man versus what was the one that Stephen King wrote about, the 18-wheelers that had their own will or something, whatever it was. That is what it is. And the thing that makes that scary is that the nature and the technology will have their own driving forces, whereas in man versus self, the driving force is the same on both sides of that conflict. Man and himself both have the same motivation, but normally the conflict comes in when he's trying to decide what it is to do, right? Man versus man, normally it's the same thing that they want, right? Man versus man in pursuit of the pretty lady. They both want the same pretty lady. That's why there's a conflict. Man versus nature is interesting because nature doesn't care about you. Maybe nature just wants to eat you. This, I think, is closest. So the unparalleled desires of nature. Nature's desires do not run parallel to yours, the way that, for example, another person's desires probably do. Now, that's maybe not the best example because if they run parallel, they never intersect, whereas the conflict is an intersection of the wants. But man versus fate, man versus supernatural, and man versus God, I think all fall into the man versus nature category because you are not sure of the motivating factors of fate or the supernatural or God. This, however, is man versus society, which is essentially man versus man. And you have that best encapsulated by the fact that it's not just a whole group of people that are accusing Aushicum. It is his arch nemesis that is doing the accusations. It's just the other people who are carrying out what they consider to be the law in this situation. Their own opinions. Who cares about other people's opinions? We'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. So, another interesting literary discussion that comes up around this is the idea of Blackstone's ratio. What is Blackstone's ratio? It was later sort of co opted by Benjamin Franklin, who just kind of did the most American thing that you can do with something and just made the numbers bigger. So, in criminal law, this also from Wikipedia, Blackstone's ratio, more more recently referred to occasionally as Blackstone's formulation, is the idea that it is better that 10 guilty persons escape than one innocent suffer. And oftentimes you will see people credit this to Benjamin Franklin, who basically said it's better that 100 guilty people get away than one innocent man go to prison. That is the way that most people see it. Reputational harm rarely works that way. Reputational harm almost always works the opposite way, but we're going to stick with Blackstone's ratio for a moment. There is a possibly apocryphal quote from Otto von Bismarck, more of an authoritarian type than Benjamin Franklin, who supposedly said the opposite of this. It is better that 100 innocent men go to prison than one guilty man run free. Now, why do I bring that up? Why do I bring that up with this story? Because that, I think, is the thrust of the story there. Aushicum is innocent. We know that as the reader. The mayor doesn't know that. The owner of the pocketbook doesn't know that. If we're being charitable, even Malandane does not know that. Malandane might have convinced himself that what he saw in that street as Aushicum bent over really was picking up a pocketbook. All of them, despite the fact that there's zero evidence here, zero actual evidence, zero tangible evidence, there is the eyewitness account of one old codger who does not actually seem very reliable, seems pretty motivated on the other side of things. There is that one witness. There's no actual evidence. Everyone still seems pretty okay with the fact that Aushicum is going to suffer for this. And no one believes him after the fact. So he is part of Bismarck's ratio. One of the 100 innocent men essentially suffering from societal prison, essentially cancel culture, has gotten Aushicum. Nobody believes him. Everybody thinks he's a thief. There's no evidence of this. And despite that, he is the innocent, despite the fact that there is no evidence, despite the fact that we, the reader, know he did not do it, he does not literally go to prison. But he suffers none the less. He is in his own confinement, right? The next thing worth talking about here. So I think that Blackstone's ratio, if you're going to, for example, be writing a paper on this, Blackstone's ratio is something interesting to talk about because what it does is it calls into question whether or not it is acceptable that someone who is innocent gets punished for something they did not do, which is the sort of moral, the sort of moral fulcrum of this story. I think a lot of people believe in Blackstone's ratio, that it is better that 100, well, Franklin's ratio, 100 guilty people never suffer for what they did than it is for one innocent person to suffer for something they didn't do. I think a lot of people believe that. But is reputational damage the same way? The nastiest, perhaps, practice from media is that they will run a headline about someone on Monday. Front page news. John Q. slaps puppies. Oh, wow. John Q. slaps puppies? That's awful. But no, they don't write it that way. Someone has accused John Q. of slapping puppies. That way they're not the ones making the accusation. Well, on Wednesday, it turns out that John Q. never slapped a puppy in his life, and it's proven. On Friday, the media issues an apology on the back page. 5 days after, they have already slandered John Q. That's the way the media works. That's the way reputational damage works. That's the way the slime balls who want to do things like this to people wheedle their weaselly little fingers into someone else's perception. So, while and whereas most people would believe in something like Blackstone's law, or Blackstone's ratio, pardon me, with reputational damage, with reputational harm, with attacks on someone's character, it never works out that way. It never works out that way. So, you break a law. You do slap a puppy, and you go to jail for it. You've done your time. Maybe, at the end of this, most people will recognize he's done his time. Probably he's not going to go slapping many puppies again. Reputational harm never works that way. What is the correct amount of time for someone's reputation to be repaired? There is none. There is none. So, little slime balls like Malandane, who is a scumbag, and knows he's a scumbag. I think he knows he's a scumbag. Maybe he thinks that that was actually a wallet that Aushicum picked up. These people, who are doing nothing with their own lives, have this type of leverage on society. And it's the only thing that they can do. It's the same thing as someone who is a thief, right? Because while and whereas the thief is stealing from someone's business, so too is the reputational snake, stealing from someone's work, someone's labor. And it's weird because, look, first off, there will always be someone willing to lie about you. But the underneath all of these things, that idea of regaining, so reputation is not immediately fungible, but it can be immediately disqualifying, right? there's nothing saying that because people hold you in high regard, oh, hey, I got a flat tire by the side of the road. Still not going to help you. But regardless of what the truth is, if you have that reputational harm, there will be people willing to not help you because of it, right? So just because you have a good reputation is not a positive necessarily. It is not fungible for anything. Having a good reputation just means you have a good reputation. But having a bad reputation will be a real world negative. So it's just interesting the way that works. Now, on to the writer's corner of things. Get to the right page here. We get this quote very early in the story as Aushicum is going to the market. Some led a cow or a calf by a cord, and their wives, walking behind the animal, whipped its haunches with a leafy branch to hasten its progress. They carried large baskets on their arms, from which in some walked with a quicker in some cases chickens and in others ducks thrust out their heads, and they walked with a quicker, livelier step than their husbands. Their spare, straight figures were wrapped in a scanty little shawl, pinned over their flat bosoms, and their heads were enveloped in a white cloth glued to the hair and surmounted by a cap. Then a wagon passed at a jerky trot of a nag, shaking strangely, two men seated side by side, and a woman in the bottom of the vehicle, the latter holding on to the sides to lessen the hard jolts. From what I just read, what's the image you have in your mind? If I were to bet, if I were to put money down, it would be that last part. Then a wagon passed at a jerky trot of a nag, shaking strangely two men seated side by side and a woman at the bottom of the vehicle. Why? Why? I'll tell you why. I believe this comes from John Gardner in The Art of Fiction, but I can't remember. The best way to paint a crowd, should you need to paint a crowd, the best way to do it is to give some generalizations. It's a sporting crowd, it's a sporting event, so everyone was wearing red. Red hats and red jerseys all around. And then there was one man dressed in a clown outfit, but it was yellow, and he had a red nose and red hair, yellow face paint. By doing this, by giving us the one image on which to focus, you're actually building what is closer to what we will be seeing in an entire crowd. The best way to build a crowd is to give generalizations and then one image. Because when you look at a crowd, so those generalizations are hazy in your mind, right? Everyone was wearing a red jersey and a red hat. Kind of hazy. Can't see anything too particular. Then you give the one image. Why does this work so well? When you look at the crowd, you're looking at something. If there is a clown in the middle of a Kansas City Chiefs football game crowd, you're going to be looking at that clown. And then everyone else, while you're looking at that clown, the image of them will be kind of hazy. So it works out in a very realistic fashion for your mind's eye. Your mind's eye will see the generalizations as hazy, and that one image, that one individual in crystal clear fashion. So it is painting for your mind's eye the same thing that you see with your actual eye. So that's how building a crowd works. And then, it's a very short story, so this won't take long to flip the page here. We get this. He went along, stopping his friends, beginning endlessly. So this is after Aushicum has been proven innocent, but still no one believes him. He went along, stopping his friends, beginning endlessly his statement and his protestations, showing his pockets turned inside out to prove that he had nothing. They said, "Old rascal, get out." And he grew angry, becoming exasperated, hot, and distressed at not being believed, not knowing what to do, and always repeating himself. That's bad writing. Why? Why is that bad writing? Because this is telling, not showing. The author here is, and I'm not saying it's a bad short story, right? But of course, it can have bad writing in it. The author here is telling us what Aushicum did. Just in the same way that we can build a really convincing audience or crowd by giving one example and the rest hazy, a good way to do what de Maupassant is trying to do here is by giving us one actual account. If early in that story, when, for example, Aushicum is heading to the market, he says, he wanted to pick up his neighbor, what's a French name? All along. That's a pretty good French name. I wanted to pick up my neighbor all along. Some tomatoes. Okay, so now we know his neighbor has a name. We know that his neighbor has... We know he has a neighbor. We know his neighbor has a name, and he knows it. And we know that he has some sense of duty to his neighbor. He's looking for this thing for his neighbor. Okay, great. We have a character that's not a whole lot, right? We don't have to put a whole lot of work into that character. After all of this goes down, Maître All has this conversation with him, literally on the page. Maître All said, "I do not trust you, you old bugger." Right? That way we know how deep this reputational rot goes. And that becomes something very real for your reader versus this just sort of, well, he tried to talk to people and no one wanted to listen to him. That's not very fun to read. That's not very real. That doesn't hit home at all. But if Maître All is telling him to get lost and beat it, now we feel that. That is showing this conversation as opposed to telling us that these conversations have happened. That is all I have for this poetry. For this short story discussion, if you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this short story discussion with other individuals. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos every single week. There's poetry every Monday, and as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.